In 2019, I was editing Southey's biography of Wesley and also Southey's collected letters. I tend to say Southey, where he lived in Keswick. There's still a street named after him. They tend to say Southey. Nobody really knows. Byron rhymed it with mouthy, Southey and mouthy. So I was editing this person's collected letters, and I came upon a correspondence that began after the publication of the biography in 1820. In December of that year, Southey was sent a copy of part of a letter that Wesley received in probably 1774, when Wesley was 71 years old. The letter was written by a 21-year-old woman who lived in London and had been receiving spiritual guidance from Wesley. This woman, we think, was Philithea Briggs. She was the granddaughter of one of Wesley's oldest allies, Vincent Perelet, and the daughter of his lay assistant, William Briggs. She was single. Wesley, of course, was married. In her letter, Philithea accuses her spiritual advisor of touching her sexually against her will. She writes as someone, to use today's parlance, who has been groomed to revere and love an older, wiser, powerful man, and then left feeling let down, violated, and guilty, yet still desperate for her advisor's affection. She is afraid to rebuke him, although certain that what he has been doing is wrong. She hopes their love can be renewed on new terms. In Southey's words, she writes in a most impassioned strain of personal affection and spiritual reverence, remonstrating with him upon the liberties which he had taken with her, in language that at the same time confesses a boundless love and expresses the alarm and indignation of a mind which still retained its virtuous principles. The fragment of Philothea's letter that Southey was sent begins mid-sentence, and it mixes third-person scenarios, referring to somebody who's known only as he, with second-person remarks made directly to the addressee, you. Here's the first part. Believe him insincere, and though I was soon constrained to believe that it was owing to his excessive purity, yet neither his years nor character could reconcile or give sanction to such kind of familiarity. Such conduct, though in one as blameless as an angel, I could never think consistent with the apostolic injunction, 1 Timothy 5:2. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. We cannot but think that Christian love makes all distinctions void. Still, there is a difference, and it is good for a man not to touch a woman. When we meet in paradise, all these ties and limits will be at an end. But at present, how much depends upon your keeping the order of providence? I have often revolved it over in bitterness of spirit. Does he take advantage of my simplicity? Does he avail himself of my love? If he judges of me by my behavior and submission to him, he must conclude that the first man who wins my affections might bring me to anything. Or could he ever judge so unkindly of me? But I have spirit and the strictest honor. No one should ever take a second liberty with me. I can resent an affront in meekness, yet so as to prove I am not to be imposed upon. Well, this letter impressed Southey. He said that it has the true stamp of passion. Very few persons would be capable of writing it unless under the influence of the feelings which it so strongly and naturally expresses. It rings true today, I think, from what we know about the terrible conflicts of feeling that survivors of sexual abuse experience. Evidently, this advisor caused Philothea great emotional and spiritual distress. He was self-interested and callous. He abused his power. Philothea was also, to use another term, current term, being gaslighted into thinking that her abuse was her fault. She says, if he judges of me by my behavior and submission to him, he must conclude that the first man who wins my affections might bring me to anything. But she rejects that thought. She is not a loose woman who is up for it. I have spirit and the strictest honor. And part of this spirit comes from her Christian education. She uses her biblical quotations, Timothy and also 1 Corinthians, to imply that her abuser was hypocritical. Supposedly teaching Jesus' love, he contravened the biblical injunctions of Jesus' disciples to protect sisters' purity and not to touch a woman. Implicitly, she suggests that Methodist doctrine has been perverted into a predator's grooming technique. Wesley has advised Philothea in 1771, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. All is contained in humble, gentle, patient love, every right temper, and then all right words and actions naturally branch out of love. In effect, you want nothing but this, to be filled with the faith that worketh by love. But love now became her emotional entanglement with her advisor, who took advantage of it to enjoy her body, as if this was normal or even proper. Evidently, he ignored her opposition and her feelings, although she was both angry and upset. She goes on, let not this seem to insinuate disrespect to my beloved and ever-honored friend. I am far from intending it, though I must say he was greatly mistaken in thinking I approved all. My nature was averse to it, nor could the neatness and delicacy wherein he so much excelled, nor my boundless affection reconcile me to it, even abstracted from consequences, appearances, etc. I am persuaded my hints were plain enough, that his penetration easily discerned what I liked or disliked, and that he has often seen evident marks of indignation and distress. Full of love, she sees him again, only again to be subjected to physical advances that leave her in mental turmoil, and she hints, harming herself. However, I soon forgot, and my love for him and desire to see him taught my willing feet to run. Again, I received fresh, cordial assurances of a love dearer to me than life, but accompanied with what I could not bear. Then my grief and conscience constrained me to reject the kindest invitations, and I suffered a continual martyrdom and sacrifice. What did I feel when I might have enjoyed his presence almost every hour, and yet I dared not? My love of his company and instructions, the fear of displeasing God or my dearest friend, with the violence I was constrained to offer myself, had too painful an effect, and those days embittered which otherwise would have been some of the happiest of my life. How cutting were his tender reproaches, how exquisitely did I suffer by every kind upbraiding word and look. Philothea then turns from her own suffering to the scandal that has been caused within Methodism. The manner in which it affected others was as various as their circumstances and turn of mind. Some were offended, others struck with astonishment. The bold and forward pleaded it as a precedent and excuse for familiarity with the other sex, and the reserved were grieved and dejected. Some kept at a distance, and some were quite disaffected. Others consented to visit, but with pain and reluctance. I heard one say that she lost the whole benefit of a winter's attendance upon his public ministry, and could only think of, physician, heal thyself. In some societies, it was talked of too freely, and even amongst the unawakened. In short, it was a matter of universal grief, a stumbling block to many, and a pain to all. After this, Philothea turns again to second person address, declaring her love for the addressee of the letter, her father, asking his forgiveness for complaining and afraid that he will be angry with her. "Oh, my ever-honored father, my tenderest beloved friend, can you yet bear with me? It was the fear of giving you pain that kept me so long silent. You must believe that only love has dictated this letter. How I have loved your feeling heart can tell, and I can truly say every tender and respectful sentiment remains as ever, only heightened, and my heart enlarged to love every day, to love each day beyond the former. If you will condescend to hear me kindly and forgive, I shall think myself the happiest of women. Be for the future all unreserved. I know you will not bear resentment, but your transient displeasure I cannot bear." And then she ends in a way even more extraordinary than what has already been, by any standards, an extraordinary letter. "I shall not see you willingly unless you favour me with a line and say if yet you can allow me an interest in your prayers and affections. Do not leave me in suspense, but if possible, let Betty," that's her sister, "have a letter for me before next Thursday. If she gives it me unseen, perhaps not even my sister may know of my writing." And I think there the phrase "my sister" doesn't refer to her blood sister. It's a term used in Methodism for a beloved woman, and it may refer to the wife of the addressee. So if the addressee is Wesley, this would be Wesley's wife, often known as sister. "When I see you, I entreat you to take no notice if I weep. I think your kindness will not see it. For oh, remember how much I feel and how much I love. I beg of you to burn this. May you be blessed in every blessing. May all your pleasures prove a scale to heaven, and may you forgive and be still kindly affected to her," etc. Well, who was Philothea talking about in this letter? Southey was clear she was talking about Wesley himself, and that her charges, in his words, affected Mr. Wesley's moral and religious character more seriously than any direct charge which was ever brought against him by his enemies and calumniators. Why? Well, because the letter showed so vividly the distress caused to an innocent young woman and a believer in Wesley's Christian ministry and in Wesley himself. It showed Wesley, if he was the person being complained about, as heartless, hypocritical, and persistent, the abuse carried on despite her visible distress. It showed power being misused and affection being betrayed. It showed Methodist teaching, everything Wesley had shaped and fostered, being perverted for selfish sexual satisfaction, religious hypocrisy, moral evil. From what it said and the way it said it, the letter, Southey was sure, was not a lie. The writer had experienced what she said she had. He did not think it was a forgery invented by someone else, not Briggs, to blacken Wesley's character. But he was not sure, and he was only sent a copy, and not of the whole letter at that. And the original mysteriously could not be traced. So, as an experienced historian and editor, he investigated the letter's provenance. The copy had been in the possession of Wesley's estranged wife, a woman who was known to have been angry and vengeful at what she perceived to be his infidelity. This source gave Southey pause. He knew Wesley's wife had wanted to hurt Wesley, and he thought her capable of extreme actions. And so, because he could not be utterly certain that the letter was genuine, he did not publish it. But something else, he does not seem to have considered that the letter might not be accusing Wesley. It might be accusing someone else, complaining about a Methodist preacher and advisor known to Wesley. Perhaps the third person, he, is not the same person as the second person, you. Perhaps the copy began in mid-sentence so that the copyist could give the impression that Philothea was indicting Wesley, when in fact she was looking for his support. In this scenario, Philothea was writing to Wesley, somewhat afraid of incurring his displeasure at raising so unwelcome a matter as a rogue preacher, but nevertheless hoping that he might restore her faith in Methodist teaching. Or in another scenario still, she, or perhaps someone else, had sent Wesley a letter that was about someone else and also addressed to someone else. A letter forwarded to Wesley. Wesley, in this scenario, was neither the person complained about nor the person addressed, but instead someone for a victim to appeal to by forwarding a letter, to appeal to because he was the head of the Methodists. So let's have a look at the evidence. First, the internal evidence. The letter begins, "I was soon constrained to believe it was owing to his excessive purity, yet neither his years nor character could reconcile or give sanction to such kind of familiarity." This remark suggests that the perpetrator was a man of relatively advanced age, his years, as Wesley was. But it's third person, as if Philothea is writing about someone else other than the recipient of the letter. She then says, "When we meet in paradise, all these ties and limits will be at an end. But at present, how much depends upon your keeping the order of providence. I've often revolved it over in bitterness of spirit. Does he take advantage of my simplicity? Does he avail himself of my love?" So to me, this turn to direct address is a weighty piece of evidence. It does suggest that the he and the you in the letter are the same man, a man whom she is urging to keep his hands to himself until providence brings them to paradise, when touch will be purely spiritual. When she again turns to the third person, it is to entreat the addressee by creating a dramatic scenario in which she debates with her own conscience. In this context, "Does he take advantage of my simplicity?" might refer to another man, but also might be a way of illustrating to the addressee, the abuser, the mental turmoil that his actions have produced in her. If the letter was addressed to Wesley, then on this scenario, he was the spiritual advisor whom Philothea had come to love, only to be repeatedly touched up by him. Again, in the third person, Philothea says, "Though I must say he was greatly mistaken in thinking I approved all. My nature was adverse to it, nor could the neatness and delicacy wherein he so much excelled reconcile me to it." Well, Wesley was renowned for personal neatness and delicate manners and cleanliness. So this remark might be indirect evidence that the he was Wesley himself. Much of what follows could apply to Wesley or to another preacher. She calls the addressee "my tenderest beloved friend" and refers to the abuser, the third person in the letter, as "my dearest friend." Again suggestive, though not conclusive, because these terms fit the loving language that Wesley had used to her as he did to other younger women in letters, a language of Christian love. Then there is the question of reputation. Apparently some scandal is already abroad about the improper relationship. I heard one say that she lost the whole benefit of a winter's attendance upon his public ministry and could only think of "physician, heal thyself." In some whole societies, it was talked of too freely. So from these details, I draw the inference that the man concerned was very well known and highly respected amongst Methodists. Why would whole societies be agog otherwise? Wesley fits the bill here, but so might other revered leaders. I thought that Philothea's language as a literary critic was important evidence. She writes deep in love, afraid to lose the love of the addressee by protesting about the abuse. "Can you yet bear with me?" she says. "It was the fear of giving you pain that kept me so long silent. You must believe that only love has dictated this letter. How I have loved, your feeling heart can tell. And I can truly say every tender and respectful sentiment remains as ever, only heartened, and my heart enlarged to love each day beyond the former. If you will condescend to hear me kindly and forgive, I shall think myself the happiest of women. Well, I find it difficult to imagine why she would be so afraid of losing the addressee's love if she were simply reporting to Wesley as the addressee someone else's abuse. He had, after all, previously acted to remove James Wheatley from the Methodist connection on the grounds of his sexual immorality. Reporting another person's abuse might be a risk for her and might well cause Wesley pain. But would it produce so heartfelt and intimate a plea? I cannot be sure. But this sounds to me more like a woman deeply in love with a powerful man whom she believed to be good, wanting him to reform himself, to forgive her for raising the issue, and still to love her. She is deeply emotionally invested, but trying to establish ground rules. Too late, of course, and it may always have been too late, considering the power imbalance. Then there's the secrecy that she asks for. If she was asking Wesley to support her complaint about someone else, it seems to me unlikely, however distressed and ashamed she was, that she would want absolute secrecy. She would know she was initiating a semi-public inquiry. Would she not also have been likely to mention witnesses to the abuse or to her feelings who could endorse her complaint? So potentially this fits either the scenario that Wesley had been sent a letter that was written to and about someone else, or the scenario that it was written to and about him. Finally, there's the ending. When I see you, I entreat you to take no notice if I weep. I think your kindness will not see it. For, oh, remember how much I feel and how much I love. I beg of you to burn this. This language is very highly charged, making it perhaps unlikely she's referring to someone else as the abuser. To me, this reads as Southey read it, as a most impassioned strain of personal affection and spiritual reverence. Whether that affection and reverence and distress is for Wesley, or whether he had been sent a love letter that Philothea had written to and about another man, remains in question. Well, what external evidence is there as to whether it was Wesley's abuse and hypocrisy that she complained of? Wesley's letters provide some evidence, but not all easy to interpret. His correspondence with Philothea changed tenor in December 1774. A disturbance in her feelings had occurred then. In that month, he notes that Philly has stood such shocks as might have overset some of the most established souls we have in London. Here he sounds sympathetic and speaks as if these shocks are independent of his doing. But he remarked also in a letter sent on the same day to her sister, "You have done what you could in this matter, and angels can do no more. I am glad you tried. By the by, she may see more clearly." Then there's a mysterious statement in a letter to her aunt sent in August 1775. Wesley says, "I dreamed last night that the Spaniards were come and were searching all houses and putting men to the torture. But on a sudden they were vanished out of the land. I could not tell how. My Betsy," that's her sister Elizabeth, "should not think that I am ever so busy as not to have leisure to read and answer her letters. I think Philothea too, since I am alive again, should have written to me either in verse or prose." He's alive again because he's been ill. At the least, this dream suggests that Philothea was associated in Wesley's mind with threats to him and or to other men. The transition from the Spaniards to Betsy and Philothea. By now, Philothea had evidently stopped communicating with Wesley, perhaps because she had no satisfaction whether he was the abuser or the valued confidant who might rectify matters. And now for some evidence that Southey wasn't aware of at the time, and is still coming to light now. Some of it has been found by the editor of Wesley's letters, and some of it I found. In February 1776, the affair took an unexpected turn that endangered Wesley's reputation. Philothea's letter of complaint was published anonymously in a letter to a newspaper. Not only this, but it was positively identified as a letter to Wesley, complaining about his conduct. This caused a stir. Several newspapers reported the scandal. Readers wrote in, giving their opinion. For example, a correspondent naming himself simply J.R. wrote to the editor of the London Packet, declaring that he had many reasons to doubt the truth of the letter's accusations from the general character, John Wesley. He then appealed to common sense for his interpretation that the letter was not accusing Wesley, but was about the author's seduction by another man, and was sent to Wesley, his words, as to a father and friend. She tells him her situation in the simplicity of her heart. She begs his friendly advice. She entreats his forgiveness for troubling him with her concerns. And the subject being of so delicate a nature, begs the whole may remain a secret. And this, I think, would seem a plausible reading, perhaps, except that J.R. then reveals his bias by suggesting that a certain unhappy spirited woman, i.e. Wesley's estranged wife, has orchestrated the publication. Have no more to do with her, open your eyes, says J.R. He so clearly wants there to have been a conspiracy to damage Wesley by manipulating Philothea's letter that it becomes hard to see his interpretation as objective or even-handed. He also ignores the evidence that Philothea's lover was a man of great renown among the Methodists, and that her language to the addressee was more that of a lover than a daughterly friend. So again, we cannot be sure. Wesley himself wrote a letter to the newspaper in response. He challenged the person whom he assumed to have been responsible for its appearing in the press, Joseph Chambers, a friend of his estranged wife's. This is what he said. Part of a letter said to be written to me has been published in the Public Ledger, with several scurrilous and abusive reflections upon me, grounded thereon. I require you to publish the whole original letter, duly authenticated, with the superscription and name subscribed. Then you will have a right to expect a further answer. From this response, we might infer that Wesley thought himself above replying in detail to anonymous attacks. But one could also conclude that he knew that if the superscription was printed, it would be clear that the letter had not been addressed to him. On the other hand, his demand that the subscription, the name subscribed, should be published is essentially a demand that nobody was going to fulfill, since that would reveal the name of the author of the letter, Philothea, who was still alive. I think nobody would have done that. In reply, Joseph Chambers, to whom Wesley had publicly addressed this letter in the newspaper, insisted that he did not possess the letter and had not sent it in part or whole to the Public Ledger. So he disclaimed any knowledge of the affair. So again, we cannot be sure what to believe. It seems that Philothea dropped her correspondence with Wesley permanently, for in 1780, he regarded her as fallen by the wayside, having lost her love. I am glad, he wrote, you have met with Phyllis Briggs. She did taste of the pure love of God, but unprofitable reasonings stole away her strength. One would hope she is now recovering it. Why did she stop writing to or seeing Wesley? Either because he was the abuser or because he didn't take action against the person complained about. The former seems more plausible a reason, nor am I aware of a sex scandal involving another senior preacher in 1775. So if anybody here knows of one, that would clear the matter up, perhaps. Another tranche of evidence takes the form of Wesley's previous romantic involvements. Wesley had quite a history of letting an intimacy that he was able to achieve because he was a priest turn into sexual play. When young, this seems not to have been a conscious strategy, but was nevertheless a tendency that he was aware of and regretted, as his journal shows. Despite these regrets in his journal, it happened again. Counseling women as to their souls, he allowed himself, once he had engaged their affections, and they his, to enjoy their bodies. Spiritual guidance, sublimating erotic attraction, proceeded to physical touching in a way that muddied the spiritual waters, and that looked improper or compromising, not just to us today in terms of Me Too, but to observers at the time. Examples of this behavior come from 1725, when he continued a friendship with Sally Kirkham after her marriage, noting in his journal that he lay on her breast and clasped her hands in his. The following year, he made a diary entry in cipher, promising to never touch Kitty Hargreaves' hand again. In August, however, he resolved never to touch a woman's breasts again. Then there's the relationship with Sophie Hopkey in Savannah, Georgia, where Wesley had gone in 1735 to be the priest of the infant colony and a missionary to the Indians. Despite his first expressed intention to have no intimacy with any woman in America, he commenced seeing Sophia, his parishioner, the teenaged Hopkey, every 2 or 3 days. He wrote that, having been careful at first to speak only on things pertaining to grace, one day at the end of July, after talking for some time, he took her hand and before parting, kissed her. And from this time, I fear there was a mixture in my intention, though I was not then sensible of it. Unless I prayed without ceasing, I could not avoid using some familiarity or other which was not needful. Sometimes I put my arm round her waist, sometimes took her by the hand, and sometimes kissed her. To stop himself, he told her that he resolved never to touch you more, at which she seemed surprised and deeply serious. But he soon renewed his caresses. On a boat trip, they slept next to each other by the campfire for several nights. Wesley recorded in his journal in Latin, assuredly the fact of lying together, embracing and kissing, amounts to a confession of improper misbehavior. Evidently, Wesley's conscience was pricked. He knew he was not acting as a priest should. And indeed, the repeated one-to-one, unchaperoned meetings with Hopkey would not in the 18th century have been normal for male suitors. It was his role as a trusted priest that enabled Wesley to gain unsupervised access to young women. As Pauline Watson puts it, the power differential in the relationship was considerable. Wesley was older and superior to Hopkey in intellect and status. His role was that of her pastor and teacher. Feeling loved and expecting a marriage proposal, Hopkey found herself in a physical intimacy that she didn't necessarily discourage. It was involving of her feelings and her religious hopes, only for then Wesley to withdraw. When he wouldn't commit to marriage, he put her social and moral reputation at risk, for she was known to be spending time alone with him regularly. Worse, when she took a way out of this limbo by marrying someone else, Wesley then excluded her from communion, publicly therefore branding her as an unrepentant sinner, but not saying why he was doing so. This act was especially harsh. It looked very much like revenge. Biographers have speculated that Wesley cleaned his own conscience by deciding that Hopkey was to blame for their physical affair and was a bad person. That would be one thing, although I think not a very honest one, showing little moral self-awareness on Wesley's part. But as a priest, to exclude her from the Eucharist in this tiny colony was another thing entirely. It was a public blackening of her reputation. In Wesley's defense here, one could argue that he was only a few years older than the teenaged Hopkey, and that had he married her as he considered doing, what happened before the wedding would have been seen as courtship, although ill-advised perhaps. However, he did not marry her, he withdrew, although leading her to think that he would, and he did exclude her from communion. Her uncle was infuriated by this, as were many others. Wesley was indicted by a grand jury and fled the colony, abandoning his mission and returning to Britain. Then there is the case of Wesley's wife, Molly. She left him in 1774, taking Philothea's letter from his bureau. That's how this letter survives in the copy. It was sent to the newspapers by Molly Wesley's agency. Indeed, discovering the letter may have been the last straw for Molly Wesley. It was through her agency that it got into the press. She was by then eager that the public should see Wesley as a hypocrite and an adulterer. She had already accused him of these things in front of Methodist elders, making an embarrassing and violent scene, shouting, pulling Wesley's hair. Within Methodism, these actions led her to be viewed as a termagant and a shrew, rather than a person who might have had a cause for her undoubted rage. That she may have been from the outset a person who did not conform to male ideals of female conduct, modesty, self-effacement, quietness, gentleness, does not mean that her claims were not worth investigating, or that she should have been ignored because labeled as a difficult woman. Thus, even the standard biographer of Wesley, Henry Rack, contrives to usher Molly's accusations off stage, rather than examining them in detail, by implying without evidence that she was suffering from inherent mental illness. Rack states that Molly was subject to pathological and natural jealousy, constitutionally neurotic. Rack then accepts that charges of sexual misconduct were often made by others as well as Molly, but he simply dismisses these en masse in a single sentence as implausible. It's quite possible, though, that Philothea's letter was a genuine complaint about Wesley's behavior, and that Molly was perfectly right in her accusation in this case, and understandably angry. If so, then however embarrassingly she behaved, we should see her as a victim as well as Philothea. By 1774, of course, it goes without saying, Wesley was the revered and all-powerful leader of a huge movement, the chief officers of which were all men. He was shielded by his prestige and the vested interest of the Methodist leadership. They wanted no scandal. Women seen as too close to him risked being blamed for being so on the grounds of their immorality, as his housekeeper Sarah Ryan was. And women who complained of Wesley's conduct, as his wife certainly did when she accused him of adultery with Ryan, found that no investigation was made. Well, what to conclude from my investigation? Is this the outing of Wesley as a sexual abuser? Or is this a detective story in which nothing is detected? An editor's rabbit hole? It has certainly had many burrowings. And the answer is that, as an editor and historian, I have to say that I don't know. I suspect that Wesley was guilty on the balance of probabilities, but I cannot be sure. I think I can see that if he was not himself Philothea's abuser, led on by his own spiritual enthusiasm and hers, and desiring to give her spiritual comfort, and taking that too far. If he was not, he did not take action against the Methodist who was, but instead expected her to accept what was done to her and change her way of thinking. That, I think, is implicit in the later correspondence. But then again, perhaps he did act against the person concerned, and his action has not survived in the historical record of letters and journals. As historians, we tend inevitably to think that written documents are what happened, because that is all we have, and that is what professionally we spend our lives looking at. But this might be the very kind of thing that was not written down for very good reason. History is difficult. Sources are absent or ambiguous, and those written sources that have survived are to a degree ambiguous. I'll end then not with a verdict, but with some thoughts about Wesley and history, and about early Methodism's language of spiritual love, and also with a question. I think there's been a reluctance amongst Methodist historians until very recently to probe too deeply into Wesley's morality with regard to younger Methodist women, or if they do probe his pattern of becoming physically involved with women whom he was counseling, to explain it without apportioning any blame. Thus, Henry Rack writes of some deep-rooted psychological disability in his nature as regards relationships with women. And my problem with this verdict is that calling the repeated behavior that hurt women and endangered their reputations a disability implies that it wasn't Wesley's moral fault, wasn't a matter of choice, though of course he was a specialist in urging people to make moral choices. If, like Pauline Watson, we examine his actions from the women's point of view, do we need to revise the history of Wesley and early Methodism? Do we need to inquire whether Wesley's doctrines and practices lent themselves too easily to the blurring of spiritual advice into sexual abuse? Or even, were they unconsciously shaped by Wesley's need to sublimate his sexual desires? And if so, at what cost to women? This was a charge that Wesley himself publicly made against the Moravians when he split from the Moravians. He let it publicly be thought that their emphasis on divine bodily love, the beautiful and beloved body of Christ, had led them to adopt immoral, orgiastic sexual rituals as part of their worship. And this created a huge scandal. If Philothea's letter was not true of Wesley, but was about another preacher, had Wesley's emphasis on love and on the possibility of attaining Christian perfection through love, and on close quarters spiritual examination, had these things left young women exposed and vulnerable to abuse? Was what Philothea reported more than an accident waiting to happen? Was it an inherent tendency of early Methodism, as the cases of Wesley Hall and James Wheatley might suggest? And finally, having heard my reconstruction of the evidence, what do you think? Was it Wesley himself whom Philothea was complaining about? Thank you.